All right, so get ready to dive into some seriously interesting stuff about the future because today we're tackling emission scenarios, trying to figure out, where our planet might be headed. We've got this pretty hefty report, emissions scenarios -1.pdf,
Yeah.
and it's just crammed with all these projections about greenhouse gas emissions.
And the really interesting thing is it's not like this report just gives you one single, prediction, like this is it, this is the future. It lays out a whole bunch of possibilities.
Oh, okay, so it's kind of like choose your own adventure for the planet.
That's a great way to put it. It
Yeah.
really is like choosing your own adventure, but for the future of global emissions.
I'm into it. So how does that even work? Are we talking like different storylines for how the world might go?
Exactly. The report calls them storylines, and each one is like a different narrative about how things might evolve.
Yeah.
Based on all sorts of stuff like how much the population grows, how the economy develops, what happens with technology, even how we use land. It's all in there.
So it's about understanding like how all these different forces kind of play out and shape things.
Exactly. The report zeroes in on four main storylines: A1, A2, B1, and B2, and they each make different assumptions about these driving forces, which of course leads to wildly different emission scenarios.
Okay, let's break them down then. What's an A1 world look like?
Okay, so picture a world with super fast economic growth, like everything's globalized and technology is running the show. That's A1 in a nutshell.
Sounds kind of, I don't know, fast-paced,
Yeah.
detected.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, what about A2 then? What's going on there?
Well, A2 is a whole different story. This one imagines a world that's more, fragmented. It emphasizes local identities, regional solutions. Oh, and it assumes a much higher population growth than the other scenarios.
Mm. So A1 is all globalized and techy. A2 is more like local and people-powered. What about B1? Where do things go in that storyline?
B1, I think you could call it the optimist's scenario.
Yeah.
Think about it. Global cooperation actually working, a strong focus on sustainability, protecting the environment, social equity, all that good stuff.
Yeah, B1 does sound kind of ideal, I gotta say. All right, last but not least, we've got B2.
Right, B2. This one's interesting because it really focuses on local solutions and slower, kind of more fragmented, economic and technological development. It's not necessarily bad, but it definitely suggests a future where we're tackling those global challenges more on a region-by-region basis.
Okay, so we've got these four very different potential paths. But there's a common thread here, right? I mean, they're all being shaped by these big underlying forces. How many people there are, the economy, technology, and how we use land.
You got it. That's exactly it. And this report, it really stresses how interconnected those forces are. They don't exist in isolation. They all influence and shape each other in all these really complex ways.
Makes sense, right? Like,
Yeah.
you can't just look at how fast the population's growing without thinking about, well, what's going on with the economy or how technology's changing things.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, just look at A2. That storyline assumes the biggest population boom. We're talking 15 billion people by the year 2100,
Whoa.
right? But, most demographers today, they'd say a scenario like that is really not very likely.
So why even include it then, if it's not considered realistic?
That's a great question. And it actually gets at something super important about how these scenarios are put together. You see, they're not meant to be perfect predictions, more like tools, tools for exploring all these different possibilities, even the ones that are less likely.
So it's about like understanding the full spectrum of what could happen, even if some things are more, I don't know, probable than others.
Precisely. By including A2, even with that, kind of out there population projection, it makes us consider how different assumptions can lead to drastically different outcomes.
Gotcha. Okay, so we've got these storylines, these big picture narratives, and we've established that they're all driven by these interconnected forces. Where do we start digging in?
Well, I think it makes sense to begin with population, since it's kind of fundamental to all of this. And the report, it acknowledges right off the bat that predicting population growth is incredibly complex.
Yeah.
It actually explores a bunch of different projections within each storyline.
So it's not just like how many people will be around, but like where they are, what their lives are like, all that factors into.
Yeah, totally. It all plays into this huge, complex equation.
Okay.
And that kind of brings us to the next big driver, economic growth.
Yeah.
You might think, oh, a wealthier world equals a more polluted one.
Yeah.
But it's not always that simple.
Oh, really? That's interesting because I feel like it's easy to assume more economic activity, more energy use, more industry, more emissions.
Right. That's the common thought. But this report, it digs into this idea called convergence, basically. The idea that over time, poorer countries, they're going to catch up economically to the richer ones.
Okay.
and how that whole process plays out, that has a huge impact on global emissions.
So we could end up with a world where everyone's at basically the same economic level, but that could be good or bad for the environment, depending.
Exactly. It's all about how we get there. Like, take the A1FI scenario group. That one paints a picture of high per capita incomes all over the globe,
Mm-hmm.
but there's this heavy reliance on fossil fuels.
Okay.
So very high CO2 emissions.
So it's a cautionary tale, kind
Yep.
of. Like, just because everyone's doing well doesn't mean we're out of the woods environmentally.
Exactly. Prosperity alone doesn't equal a sustainable future. But on the flip side, there are scenarios like the AIT and the B1 family where you've got these high global incomes, but they're actually paired with lower emissions.
Interesting. So it suggests that there are other factors at play besides just, how much money we have.
For sure. It's about the choices we make, the technologies we prioritize, the values driving our development, all of that.
Okay, so it's not just about wealth, it's about how we use it.
Exactly. And speaking of technology, that's where things get really interesting. This report highlights that even if we don't have specific climate policies in place, we're still probably going to see some major advancements in renewable energy technologies.
So even without a global push for it, just because of innovation and market forces, we might see this green tech revolution.
It's a real possibility. That inherent drive for progress, for efficiency, for finding new solutions, it could lead to a shift away from fossil fuels, even without everyone agreeing on it.
That's kind of hopeful. Does the report give any specific examples of this tech-driven shift?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right.
They talk about advancements in combined cycle gas turbine technology,
Uh,
CCGT for short.
Okay,
Basically, it's a much more efficient way to burn natural gas for electricity.
got it. So that's one example. But I mean, natural gas is still a fossil fuel. What about things that are totally clean?
They also talk about fuel cells.
Mm-hmm.
These things are amazing. They can convert chemical energy directly into electricity, and the only byproduct is water vapor.
Wow. That sounds, I don't know, almost too good to be true. What if we had a world powered by these super efficient fuel cells that were running on hydrogen from, renewable sources?
Right, that's the kind of potential we're talking about.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah. It's cool to think about the role that technology can play in all of this.
For sure. But it's also important to remember that technology doesn't exist in a bubble.
Right, right.
It's all connected to those other driving forces we've been talking about.
Like land use, for example. I mean, we talked before about how biofuels could end up competing with agriculture for land. That's a perfect example of how these things can, I don't know, clash.
Exactly. The report brings up that exact risk.
Yeah.
As we're trying to get off of fossil fuels, we've got to watch out for those unintended consequences. Like, if we just ramp up biofuel production to meet all our energy needs, well, that could mean less land for growing food, and then we've got a whole other problem.
It's like this giant puzzle, Move one piece, it affects everything else.
That's a great way to put it. And it really highlights how tough it is to predict the future, which, by the way, is something the report really grapples with.
Well, we've talked about a lot of different potential futures. Some sound pretty optimistic, others a little more, I don't know, concerning. But I do have to ask, does this report consider anything truly catastrophic, like those doomsday scenarios you hear about sometimes?
Ooh, that's a big one. And it gets at the core of how this whole report is put together.
Hmm.
You see, the scenarios they lay out here, they're designed to explore futures that are plausible and relatively stable.
Okay.
Things like global pandemics, huge conflicts, major ecosystem collapses, those aren't really factored in.
So it's like they're mapping out these potential futures, but they're drawing a line in the sand and saying, okay, these really extreme things, we're not going there.
That's a really good way to think about it. It's not that they're saying those events couldn't happen.
Right.
It's more that they're choosing to focus on this, more limited set of scenarios, ones that assume, I don't know, at least a certain level of global stability. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense. Trying to account for every single crazy thing that could happen would be...
Oh, it would be impossible.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to predict the unpredictable,
Absolutely. And it would also make the whole modeling thing just ridiculously complicated.
Right.
Probably without adding a whole lot of useful insight, to be honest. I mean, by focusing on these, I don't know, more plausible scenarios, even though they're still really diverse, I think we get a much clearer picture of how those core driving forces, population, economics, technology, land, use, how those all interact and shape things within a, a reasonable range of possibilities.
Okay, yeah, it's about understanding those dynamics and then I guess the choices we make within those dynamics rather than getting lost in, like you said, all the what ifs, the doomsday stuff.
Exactly.
But I mean, we shouldn't just ignore those potential, like, catastrophic events, right? I mean, we've seen how fast a pandemic or something can just, turn the world upside down.
Oh, absolutely not. And actually, the fact that the report specifically excludes those kinds of events, I think it kind of highlights how important they really are.
Yeah.
It's like they're saying, hey, even if we don't factor in all those wild cards, the choices we're making now, they still matter hugely.
Mm-hmm.
But if you then add in the possibility of these like game-changing events, well, the stakes get even higher.
Yeah. Makes you realize these scenarios, as insightful as they are, they're just a piece of the puzzle, right?
Right.
They give us this framework, help us understand different paths we could go down, but they can't predict everything.
Exactly. They're not crystal balls. And
Whoa.
that's where, critical thinking comes in
Hmm.
and adaptability. This report, it gives us all this valuable info, but it's up to us to actually make sense of it all, to make smart decisions and to be ready to, change course when we need to.
So, big picture, what's the takeaway here? What should we, I don't know, as individuals, as a global community, what should we be taking away from all of this, from this whole deep dive into emission scenarios?
To me, the biggest takeaway is that the future isn't this fixed thing. It's not something that's just going to happen to us.
Mm.
We actually have a say in this.
We have the power to shape it through the choices we're making right now, every day.
Exactly. And it's not just about those big sweeping actions. It's the everyday stuff too. The tech we choose, the policies we support, the things we value. It's about realizing that even the small choices can make a difference. They can ripple out and change things.
That's a pretty powerful message and a hopeful one, I think. It means we're not just along for the ride. We have agency. We have the power to create a future that, well, that we can all be proud of.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And if this report shows us anything, it's that we can act now. What we do in the next few years, it's going to have a huge impact on the planet, on future generations.
Yeah.
No pressure, right?
Well, that's definitely something to think about. This has been, I don't know, kind of a wild ride, this whole deep dive. Eye-opening, for sure. A little challenging at times, but ultimately, I think pretty empowering. Gave us a lot to consider. And hopefully, got some ideas flowing about how we can all do our part to build that more sustainable future.
I like to think so. It's been great unpacking all of this with you. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And remember, listeners, the future isn't set in stone. It's up to us to write the next chapter.